My name is Mike Lerman. I'm a managing editor at the American Society for Microbiology Journals Department. I'll be moderating today's event with my colleague, Journals Development Editor Lorraine Clark. Before we start, we'll give a brief overview of ASM, its journals portfolio, provide some resources that will be mentioned during the webinar, and then introduce the speakers. Next slide, please. ASM was established in 1899, and it's a nonprofit organization committed to advancing progress in the microbial sciences. ASM has a portfolio of 16 journals, including 6 discipline-specific or clinically focused subscription journals, 7 fully open access journals, including an education journal and ASM case reports that launched just this year, and 3 review journals. Next slide, please. What all this means is that there is a home for every kind of microbiology research at ASM, which is recognized worldwide for publishing high-quality, trusted research, for its expert editors who are leading microbiologists from around the world, and for a fair and timely peer review process that ensures high scientific and ethical standards. So saying, author experience is extremely important to us. We realize that any author journey involves ethical considerations and increasingly AI, or artificial intelligence. We hope today we can answer some of the questions increasingly on people's minds about AI and scholarly research. Now I'll hand it over to Lorraine for the next section.
Thank you. Next slide, please. Thank you. If you're interested in learning more about the ASM publishing ethics policies and procedures described in this webinar, you can scan the QR code on the slide, and we will also provide the link in the chat. Information on this page includes processes for detecting and responding to ethics concerns, appealing an ethics decision, and data availability concerns. Next slide, please. The speakers will also cover ASM guidelines on generative AI. You can learn more about these by scanning the QR code on the slide, and we will also post this link to the page in the chat. Briefly, content completely generated by AI is not allowed in ASM journals. Use of AI tools must be disclosed, and AI tools cannot be considered authors. Authors are responsible for ensuring the accuracy of their manuscript contents. Next slide, please. And now I would like to introduce today's speakers. Dr. Stanley Malloy is, among other things, a dedicated microbiologist, advocate for STEM education, and prolific science communicator. He is the editor-in-chief of ASM's Journal of Microbiology and Biology Education and has served as an ASM president and chair of the ASM Ethics Committee. Dr. Malloy is also the author of a forthcoming book on research integrity. Dr. Ashi Chaturvedi is the Senior Ethics Specialist at the American Society for Microbiology. In her role, Ashi develops policies for ASM within the publishing ethics landscape and ensures that ASM policy stays aligned with COPE guidelines and industry best practices. If you have questions for the speakers, please use the Q&A functionality in the Zoom panel to enter these, not the chat. That allows us to collate the questions during the discussion section. Thank you, Stanley and Ashi, for joining us today, and over to you.
Thank you, Lorraine. And welcome, everyone. Greetings. Thank you for joining us, me and Stanley, in this conversation about AI in scholarly publishing and what to expect, how it impacts equity and ethics in scholarly publishing. And we look forward to having an engaging discussion with you all. So here I lay out the overview of the webinar session today. First, I'll give a concise overview of artificial intelligence tools and how to think about generative AI's use in research. We will focus on protecting the scientific integrity in this day and age where the use of AI and generative AI tools is becoming increasingly common. I will also lay out ASM policy on the use of generative AI for its authors, reviewers, and editors. And Stanley will mention how non-compliance with these policies and using generative AI tools without disclosures and proper mindfulness can lead to potential consequences. Although detecting the use of AI is not possible with certainty, there are definitely key indicators of generative AI use, and we will discuss those towards the end of the webinar. and follow it up with opening the floor for questions. So as Lorraine said, if you have any questions during the webinar, please continue to add them to the Q&A box, and we'd be happy to take them at the end of the talk. So artificial intelligence has been around us for a long time. It has wide variety of uses, and it itself is can be described as a composite of various tools, a lot of different technologies are included within artificial intelligence. There's machine learning, there's artificial neural networks, there's deep learning. You must have heard of natural language processing. And all of these technologies and many more make artificial intelligence the beast that it is today. Generative AI is only a small component of artificial intelligence. And the reason it became so critical in our discussion and led to our discussion today is since the launch of ChatGPT in 2022. When OpenAI launched ChatGPT in 2022, generative AI and large language models came into the forefront of every discussion. We finally saw what artificial intelligence can do, how a user can enter a prompt or an input into a chatbot, into a large language model that has been trained on its own database, called its training database, and how it can then lead to the generative AI tool, generate a response, create an absolutely new content for its users based on the user's requirements or prompts. So where artificial intelligence was only aiming at mimicking human behavior and responses and how humans think and operate, its idea was to remove repetition from tasks of human beings. Now it could simulate and mimic further about how humans you can actually have a chat with a chatbot and generate original content. That is where the concerns began. That is where we realized that not just generative AI is a powerful tool with great potential, there are also several risks, especially when used for research and scholarly publishing. In the next slide, Stanley will tell you about the various kinds of usage that AI tools and generative AI tools can have. And for the purposes of this talk, we are focusing on the power of generative AI tools. Stanley, you're muted.
Generative AI can be used for virtually anything in research, and that's why this is such a big problem. People use generative AI for brainstorming, thinking about research ideas, for collecting the data that goes into telling a story, for organizing that data in a meaningful way, analysis of the data, visualization of the data, identifying resources and where the data comes from and where you can look for more data like that. Coding, AI is used very extensively nowadays in coding. And of course, in translation and grammar, which have done a lot to universalize scientific communication. So all of these are potential applications. Each one of these has its own caveats when you think about ethical considerations and you think about the role on equity. Ashit, back to you.
So now is the time for a little poll. Please share your experience with us. We have 2 poll questions for you. The first one looks at how you have used generative AI in your own research and how frequently you've done so. And the second question will build up on this, elaborating further about what was the kind of use you did with generative AI tools and how it benefited your research, if it did. I'll give about 20 seconds or so for you to answer these poll questions. And this would help us understand the breadth of the attendees here and how your usage has been. And also, if you're seeing any benefits with using generative AI in your own work. Last 5 seconds, I suppose. Great. Okay. So for the first question, we do have about 1/3 of the attendees who have never used AI in their research for any purposes. And we also have people who are at various levels of exploring AI use in their research. That's interesting. And the next question, okay, so we're starting the next poll now. So the question is, in your experience, what has been the most impactful benefit of using AI? And I'll give another 20 seconds or so for this question. Is it for content writing and editing, for literature reviews and summaries, for creation of new content like text and images, advanced analysis, or just for increasing efficiency and reducing repetition in your tasks? 5 more seconds. All right, time for results. Okay, so almost half of the users have used it for enhanced writing and editing. Some have been using for literature reviews and increasing efficiency. Very few have explored creating new content and using it for analysis. Thank you so much for sharing your experience. Now we know how the attendees today have used generative AI. Let me share a survey. If I can change my slide. Okay. So here I am sharing a survey that was recently conducted by Oxford University Press, and the findings are available at the link below. What I want to stress here is that this survey was conducted on a wide variety of respondents. There were about 2,300 respondents, and they came from not just STM fields, but various scholarly fields. And they were at various stages of exploring these generative AI tools, from people who embraced the use of AI completely to those who were absolutely opposed to it. Some were skeptics, some were trying it at different stages. So we need to keep this in mind when we're discussing this survey. But the findings were very interesting. 76% of these 2,000 survey respondents had used an AI tool for some or the other purpose of their research. Most commonly used AI tools were machine translation and AI chatbots. And when the respondents used this, about 30% of them did report that that they benefited from using AI for their tasks. And as Stanley shared in the previous slide, the uses were varied, from brainstorming ideas using a chatbot to identifying resources, collecting data, analyzing, writing, editing. There were all sorts of uses. But what you would see in this graphic representation that was generated by Michael Lerman using the survey data was that certain users were more popular than other users. And that you can see by the size of the alphabets in these words. So whereas some used it for brainstorming, you can clearly see that the most common users were those for identifying resources. So that includes literature survey and identifying more current literature, to editing, which is another very popular use where people used it for editing the write-ups. And that matches the survey that we just did, where identifying resources and editing were the top uses. So we know AI is powerful, it's gaining popularity, and should we be concerned? Stanley.
So if I could just comment on, there was a mention in the chat of AI also being used for education and real value being able to break down complex ideas. I think that ties into what we're talking about today, where AI transcends this from research to education and everything in between. And in all of those cases, I think it's really important for us to think about the ethical consequences. But so what are the concerns about AI use by authors specifically, right? So the first one is reproducibility. AI databases change very rapidly in real time. And so if you want to reproduce something, you would need to be able to go back and get that same data and the same analysis tools and use them for reproduction. That is very often difficult with AI, the way we currently use it. Transparency is another big thing, right? So there's a concern about algorithm bias. There are concerns about biases of the database that might have, for example, it might underrepresent certain geographical regions or certain types of demographic data. And so we'll give you a viewpoint that doesn't represent humans as a whole, or microbes as a whole. The quality control is a big issue. So the data sets that are used can be manipulated. Plagiarism gets to be very easy to produce and very difficult to detect. And copyright is a major problem because much of the information that feeds into the databases is copyrighted material. And it's very hard for the user to detect that. Data privacy and security is a very big issue. That's tied in part to public domain access. And oversight is a big problem. Responsibility for the data and the interpretations of the data and compliance approval are real key issues that are often neglected when we start using these enormous databases. The underlying thing, the key thing, a take-home point from all this is that accountability, honesty, and inclusivity are essential for the integrity and reproduction of our scholarly communication ecosystem. And there are issues with AI that impinge on each one of these things. Ashi, next slide, please. So if you say, what are the things that are okay and what are the things that aren't okay for authors? So acceptable uses include checking spelling and grammar, a very useful tool for AI, providing feedback and evaluation, formatting, finding references, identifying sources, and brainstorming and ideation. You shift into unethical issues when you start doing things like using AI without attribution or using AI as a ghostwriter, publishing content that's unverified. You can take a lot of data from some random database and come to a conclusion, but unless you validate that conclusion, it may be a case of garbage in, garbage out, right? Not explicitly noting the results that cannot be reproduced is really important. That's important in everything that we do in science. Relying on biased databases is a big problem. And sometimes it's a problem because a user may not realize that database is biased. And ignoring legal requirements. I think that's an underlying thing in virtually everything we do. Next slide, please, Sashi. So if you say, how can we protect AI in an age of scientific integrity in an age of generative AI? There's a group that's listed at the bottom. There's a paper published in PNAS, and a very distinguished group of experts in this field have talked about coming up with a national set of policies and an oversight group through the national academies that would look at integrity and the use of generative AI. And they argue several things, but three of the key things they argue are transparency and disclosure and attribution are really key. You should describe the specific tools and algorithms that you use in anything that you publish. The data sets and models input that you use is really critical to add to any publication that you're going to do. Accountability for accuracy of data and inferences. That is, you have a personal responsibility for validating AI-generated responses. You can't just use what you get. You have to validate and confirm. You have to demonstrate authenticity of the results. You have to check for potential bias in data or AI analysis, evaluate accuracy, consider potential limitations. These are things that we have always done before the advent of generative AI. It's an expectation of science, and it applies also when you use AI tools. Documentation of AI-generated data. It's really important that you distinguish synthetic data from real-world observations, right? Synthetic data can hallucinate all at once, whereas real-world observations, if they are unbiased and comprehensive, provide a genuine insight into nature. Next slide, please, Ashi. So here's a simple little flow chart about when it's okay and when it's not okay to use AI. So if you have a query and you say, oh, does it matter if the output is true? And if the answer is no, it doesn't matter, then it's no problem. If you're playing around on your computer, you want to generate some figure with AI, you can go to town. You can do whatever you want, okay? Because it doesn't matter. You're not going to publish it. It's not going to influence the world, right? But if that output does matter, then you have to say, do you have the expertise to verify that the output's correct? And if the answer is no, you should not use AI, right? You need to make sure that you validate what you get from AI. If the answer is yes, then you have to say, will you accept responsibility for any errors? And if the answer is no, you should not use AI. But if the answer is yes, it becomes okay to use AI for that process, with the caveat that it's really critical to proofread and double check for accuracy in everything that you do with AI. Next slide, please, Ashi. So here's one of the key take-home points. It's a core take-home point of science. Don't trust what you can't validate, right? So AI can give us bad data, but AI can also exploit and amplify our own cognitive limitations and biases. So AI can make something that we might have an issue to begin with and make it even worse. And that's, I think, a really particular scary aspect of thinking about AI that's not been carefully validated. Next slide, please, Ashi. Over to you.
Yes, thank you. And to add to what you were just saying, working with biased databases and having biased viewpoints to begin with, which we may not realize, it has a really significant impact on equity and how we think about equity and what we are trying to do while reporting our real life observations, right? So with all this background about how we think about AI tools, generative AI tools, and the concerns that we have, we are now at a place to understand and fully comprehend why we require policies in this regard to protect the integrity of scientific publications. And ASM has always prioritized scientific integrity in all of its publications, and we continue to do so even in this era of generative AI, but maybe a little differently, considering the implications are so different. I want to emphasize here that different publishers and different journals have different policies in this regard. These policies that I'm going to present now are ASM-specific policies, so please ensure that you are reviewing the policies of other publishers and journals as well when you're thinking about publishing your research and when you're thinking about putting together your manuscripts. ASM is a member of Committee on Publication Ethics, and all ASM journals are members of COPE, and we follow their guidelines in devising our policies and also industry best practices. So here I'll first present the key policies that we have for generative AI use for policy for our authors. The QR code is mentioned here, and also the link that takes you to the relevant asm.org page on this policy. As Lorraine also mentioned this earlier in the talk, artificial intelligence or AI tools cannot be an author, and in a minute, Stanley will explain why. Also, ultimately, it is the responsibility of all the authors of a manuscript to ensure what they're publishing is accurate and representative of the data and of their study. So they are also responsible for any ethical breaches within their manuscript because of the use of generative AI, such as plagiarism, which Stanley mentioned is a big concern when thinking about generative AI use as authors. At ASM journals, we do not accept any content that is completely generated by a generative AI tool. So AI-generated images, videos, cover art, illustration, or schematics are not allowed at ASM journals. And we know this is a moving space. We are all learning and we are all thinking about this, thinking about how to use it and how not to use it in our research. So if you have any queries, we also have a dedicated email ID mentioned here. It's called Author AI Queries at asmusa.org. It's an inbox solely dedicated to all queries about AI use in your research, in your manuscripts. And if you are confused about using a certain tool or a certain purpose for which you've used the generative AI tool, please feel free to reach out to us and we'll try our best to answer those queries. We have a very extensive editorial board for our journals. We have ethics committee, we have a dedicated ethics team and ethics panel, and we would love to answer these questions for you. Stanley.
Okay, so as a scientist, a lot of times we have a lot of rules we have to follow, right? We have compliance issues and we have checkboxes. But as a scientist, I think you always say why, right? And it's a lot easier to follow rules if you understand why they make sense, right? So the question is, why is it inappropriate for generative AI to be an author, right? So the definition of authorship that's accepted widely around the world is that only people that can take responsibility for the research that's published can be an author. And in most countries, this means it has to be defined as a legal person, right? So that alone is one of the key issues. Another thing is that when you think about potential conflicts of interest, which are very important in evaluating a publication, AI is a non-legal entity, and it doesn't have the ability to attest to potential conflicts of interest. It doesn't have the ability to manage the copyright or license agreements. Those things rely on an author that is a human who's accountable. So when you talk about accountability, that's the other key definition of an author. Authors are fully responsible for the content of their manuscript. That includes responsibility for plagiarism that may happen, for fabrication, for bias generated by AI. For all these things, we are the ones who ultimately are responsible. We can't say, oh, that AI tool was bad, right? Plagiarism is a big, big thing. Generative AI models trained on very large data sets will very often copy, sometimes just small segments, but copy parts of previously published work. And so there's a big problem of you as an author having responsibility for that copyright. Validity is another key thing here. Generative AI might use biased data sets. And so if that's true, what we are proposing as a great scientific discovery may in fact have underlying problem that makes it wrong. Okay, so there's a bunch of reasons why generative AI can't be an author. Why do we have this restriction on using generative AI images? Actually, you'll see I used a generative AI image earlier in this presentation, right? A key thing there was that generative AI image that I used was just a figure. I didn't base any science on that. I didn't use it as a model for science. It was just a picture, right? So with generative AI images that you use in a publication, the data sets are constantly evolving. And so it gets really hard to determine what data was used, or if the origin of that figure is misleading. So if the figure is meant to convey a scientific concept, that is a problem. Authenticity is a problem. Generative AI can make any image that you imagine in response to your prompt. It will make fake images if you ask it to make images that require it to make up things, right? And so that's a big issue. Privacy is a problem. Generative AI might include sometimes images of people, images of sensitive content, as we mentioned earlier, copyright. And so there's problems associated with that. And then plagiarism is an enormous problem. So proper citation is really an issue when you're using prior work. That includes when you're using previous figures or images, artistic images, and AI can feed you those images without letting you know that they're copyrighted. So it makes it difficult to reference that original source. Next slide, Ashi.
Right. And building off of this, not just AI use is a problem with authorship. There's also problems if AI tools have been used for peer review. The entire peer review ecosystem is based on trust. Trust in our peers, trust in our fellow scientists reviewing our work, and trust that the manuscript that I've submitted to a journal, to a publisher, will be kept confidential. So human expertise is vital for trust in the peer review process and, by extension, in the scientific publishing industry. What large language models like GPT-4 and human reviewers provide are their own insights on a study. And when we compare them, as they did in this study by Leong et al., where they actually compared if the same published article is reviewed by a large language model like GPT-4 versus human reviewers, how is their feedback different? It is the same study. So what they found was that in certain aspects, the feedback is similar, but there is certainly a few aspects in which large language models and human reviewers differ. So large language models, for example, comment more frequently on implications of a research, whereas the human feedback would comment on novelty of the research. It'll comment on theoretical soundness of that research, and also if there are any missing citations. That is something that maybe an LLM might not be able to figure out on its own. In certain aspects, both of the feedbacks were very helpful and very similar. For example, on clarity and presentations, both GPT-4 and human feedback were very similar. On reproducibility, judging the reproducibility of the data and comparison to previous studies, both were able to do so. But there were certain aspects that were certainly different. For example, adding more experiments. While both LLM and humans suggested additional experiments for a study, the kind of experiments they suggested were different. While both of them commented on ethical aspects, the kind of ethical aspects they were commenting on was different. For example, a human reviewer can specifically say whether a study has included IRB information or ICOG protocol information in its text or not. But an LLM would not be able to identify that specific requirement. It'll just make a generic comment on the ethical aspects of the study. So while LLMs can give you interesting feedback, sometimes even helpful feedback, they may not be able to replace human experience and expertise. AI tools struggle to assess a study's novelty, and AI and humans can rely on their own experience and expertise to provide useful feedback to the researchers. Based on several considerations of confidentiality and the way these tools work, us not knowing anything about their database and how it was trained on, NIH and NSF prohibit the use of generative AI in peer review. And so keeping all these considerations in mind and COPE's guidance on this aspect as well, generative AI use policy for reviewers is mentioned here, and you can review it further in our reviewer guidelines by using the QR code. I cannot stress this enough one more time that manuscripts are confidential documents. They are submitted to us with trust, and the reviewers are reviewing them, ensuring that the contents of that research, of those findings, will be kept confidential. So we do not, our policy requires that our reviewers do not copy and paste portions of an under review manuscript into a third-party tool or a generative AI tool. We do not know how the data will be used for training of the generative AI tool itself. We do not know where this data will be stored. And there are several important considerations when we are thinking about confidentiality and use of an under review unpublished manuscript. So if you think, if a reviewer thinks that a manuscript has used generative AI tools in its writing or in its work, we require our reviewers to notify the editors, who will then discuss this further with the editor-in-chief or the ethics team, and we'll discuss this further before acting upon it. Similarly, for our editors as well, we emphasize that because these are confidential documents, the ask is the same, that they do not copy paste portions of an under review manuscript into a third-party tool. But in addition, we do not want the editors to directly consult with the authors on how they used it, what was the purpose of the use. We do want to discuss this, so the editors contact the editor-in-chief and the journal staff for further assistance. And we communicate this with the authors in a more sensitive manner, trying to understand what they know and how they intended to use it to begin with. Also, Stanley has emphasized this previously as well, that transparency is key. We require our authors, editors, and reviewers to completely disclose any use of an AI tool or a large language model in their to us. So an author can make this in the submission form. We now have a question that asks our authors if they have used AI. And if so, it also leads them to describe that usage. They can also submit this information in their cover letter if they're comfortable in doing so. For our reviewers, we request them to provide this information in their confidential comments to the editor, so that we do not cause any undue stress to the authors. And for editors, also, we expect them to reach out to the editors-in-chief and not directly to the authors. Of course, all decisions on anything that has been disclosed to us are made on a case-by-case basis, whether the use of that generative AI tool and that purpose is acceptable to the journal or not.
So one of the key things here, actually in the Q&A, Rami Assis asked the question, is it practical or realistic for publishers to police and prevent unattributed AI-generated manuscripts? I'm going to answer that question right here instead of the Q&A because it directly ties to this. And that is, journals sometimes, we try to be real careful at catching things, but there are certain things we don't catch. Nevertheless, in science, one of the key things that's true about science is this reproducibility. And if you're unable to reproduce your experimental results, that is a sign that there is something wrong, and it can have serious professional repercussions, right? Those kinds of consequences are the consequences that are also true for scientific misconduct. The journal may have a correction or expression of concern or retraction of your paper. The funding agency may withdraw funds or ban further funding if you're publishing non-reproducible results that weren't published ethically. Your professional association may cancel your membership, remove recognitions, and employers can do admonishment, sanctions, and termination. So this is an ethical issue like so many other ethical issues. It's like plagiarism. It's like fabrication. If you behave in ways that results in an inability to reproduce science, results in inherent bias in science, then fundamentally there are potential professional repercussions. Back to you, Ashi.
Right. So now we move on to elaborating on key indicators of AI. And like I said earlier, detecting a use of AI or generative AI tool, we're not there yet. We can sense a few things, but no tool at this stage is perfect enough to confirm the use of generative AI tool yet. So this is something that Stanley created recently, and he'll elaborate further on it.
This really relates to some conversations I've been recently having with Rami Assis, who's on this webinar. And it's the basic idea that one of the ways of detecting AI usage is that there are certain words that have begun to be used in the last couple of years at very high frequency. And on this slide, you can see delve. Look at what's happened in the last 2 years compared to the previous 20 years, right? It's really increasing. And there are words like that we're seeing a lot in papers that we didn't see before. So it's a hint that ChatGPT may be involved, right? It's not proof, but it's a hint that ChatGPT may be involved. There's a lot of other analysis of this in the literature, and I could talk about it for a whole seminar, but we're running a little late. So I'm going to just shift right back to you, Ashi.
Okay. So here is a real life example of what we've been looking at. So there was one manuscript that came to our attention because the sentences did not make sense scientifically or semantically. They were also, they had abrupt ends. They did not make complete sense. We also found that there were random words inserted into this manuscript, such as phone, which had nothing to do with the context being discussed. And we found a very curious tortured phrase and a translation that was funny. So fudge makes drinks. It was essentially supposed to be fudge cocktail, which we are very familiar with. But the AI tool translated it into mixed drinks. So now we have fudge mixed drinks. We also found instances of inaccurate referencing. So while the references mentioned in the text were completely accurate, valid references, they did not accurately associate with the statement they were linked to. So there are several instances within a manuscript that can indicate that generative AI tool could have been used in the writing of the manuscript. We can still not prove it, and we cannot confront the authors based on this information. These are certainly challenging and emphasize further that we need to review our work. We need to review everything that we are submitting to the journal beforehand. Do not copy paste everything that the generative AI tool spits out in your work. We need to proof check. We need to validate everything that the generative AI tool has generated for us. And so towards the end, I would just mention some take-home points. These have been mentioned over and over again during the webinar as well, but please research the generative AI tool you're going to use. We do not use where they're storing, we do not know where they're storing the data, how they're using the data, what is the data set that they are trained on, if that data set is biased or not. We need to have these answers before we begin using a generative AI tool. We would not want to input any information into a black box tool. Stanley mentioned this further, that you need to record your use as you would a new instrument in your lab. Record everything that you did with this while using a generative AI tool. What was your prompt? What was the name or version you used? How you used it? Everything should be recorded. Please, please, please verify the content. Validate everything that has been given as an output by the generative AI tool. If you need to modify it, modify it. You need to match the citations. You need to improve the information it gave you, validate everything. Please disclose the use of AI to the editor, to the publisher, in clear words, in as much detail as you can. And lastly, stay informed. This is a changing landscape. It's a fast-moving landscape. And just as quickly as the technology is evolving, the policies are also evolving. So please stay informed and help us help you in figuring out this evolving landscape.
And I'll just add one more thing. One of the things chat bots do really nicely is they can talk to each other. And so for a real fun perspective on what AI chatbots think about their own flaws and potential concerns, check out this paper by King. DOI is listed right there. It's just pure and simple fun. Next.
Questions.
All right. So now we'll open up the floor to questions from the audience. We will try to get to as many questions as possible, but if you have additional comments or inquiries, please contact us at ethics.journals@asmusa.org. We are here to help you navigate these tricky AI issues and remain committed to pursuing best practices in scholarly publishing. So to kick us off, Ashley and Stanley, I'd like to ask, to what extent can AI such as ChatGPT be used for writing research manuscripts, and is it safe to share data to AI tools such as ChatGPT?
All right, I'll start. You should not use AI to write a research manuscript, right? That fundamentally is ghostwriting. You have a responsibility for the writing. What you can use AI tools for is to help you with the grammar or help you with the sentence construction. Even if you use it for grammar, you need to make sure you let the journal know you used it for that. But that is a very different thing. It's okay to use AI also for translation, right? That is something that can be really valuable and expand the number of people who can publish and can share scientific knowledge around the world. So those things are okay, but it's not okay to use AI to write the manuscript, right?
And yeah, and here I'd just like to add here that there are several AI tools that now offer these kind of features like translation and help with the writing of the manuscript. But that's more like editing. And that's why I said like researching the AI tools is important instead of using something like ChatGPT where we don't know how much access they have to your confidential information and your data. We would prefer that you use these other softwares which help you and are designed specifically for writing and editing of your papers rather than just doing the writing for you. Like Stanley said, writing is part of your responsibility.
The second half of that question that Lorraine asked was, is it safe to share our data by AI tools such as ChatGPT? Well, if you share it to ChatGPT, ChatGPT will share it to the world. And so that depends on if it's data that you want to share. If it's data that ultimately would be needed for a patent, if it's data that would be tied to copyright, then I think you should be really cautious, err on the safe side, because you don't want to release some data that ultimately would prevent you from getting a patent that could lead to a real valuable product that could help humankind.
And some other questions in the chat, in the Q&A have also centered around what sorts of evaluation ASM uses in order to sort of determine whether AI was used and whether ASM actually uses AI in parts of its evaluations.
So ASM uses a variety of tools when manuscripts come in to check for things. So there's a plagiarism check tool. That plagiarism check tool is very good for looking at published literature that's reproduced, but sometimes it's very hard for it to detect snippets of plagiarism that may come in with AI, right? The journals also have ways now of looking for image manipulation. And so that's another possibility, a real concern that can happen with AI, and a number of other tools. In the end, very often, these kinds of concerns come about, though, because there is a reviewer or an editor who thinks that there is something amiss with the manuscript and then catches it then. One of the things that's really true today is that we are discovering problems with image manipulation that happened decades ago. because we have better tools to do it now than we did decades ago. So I think a really important point is that in science, when you do something that's inappropriate, it may not catch you today, but ultimately it catches up with you. Again, that's because science is built on this model of reproduction and the importance of being able to reproduce critical science.
Thank you so much. I think we will do one more question. And there have been a lot of questions around what types of AI evaluations ASM journals use. Could you two talk about that a little bit?
What type of AI evaluations?
Yeah, I think, what if any AI ASM uses?
So like Stanley mentioned, we do use AI-based detection tools for detecting plagiarism and for detecting image duplication. We also use several more automation-based tools rather than generative AI tools. I don't think we use any generative AI tools, but we do use tools that are based on other aspects of AI for, say, finding reviewers or things of that nature. But yeah, I think.
Can I answer one more question that's kind of tied to that? And it says, did we use generative AI tools to prepare today's presentation? And the answer is no. In this presentation, there was one figure that was made by generative AI. It was not made by us. It was acquired from Creative Commons, where the license to use allows us to use it. And it was used because we thought it was a real artistic view of the human machine interface.
Well, thank you, Stanley and Ashi, once again for this insightful and educational dive into AI and scholarly publications. For anyone interested in becoming or staying involved with ASM journals, there are various opportunities for you to do so. You can review for ASM journals, serve as an editor or editorial board member, publish your best work in ASM journals, and tell others about our journal portfolio. And if you have feedback for us, please let us know. Next slide, please.
You can find more information about ASM's peer review process by scanning the QR code on the left. During last year's peer review week, ASM hosted a webinar titled Peering into Peer Review, and you can access the recording for this webinar on the ASM YouTube channel. We will also post links to these resources in the chat. Next slide, please. And with that, we deeply appreciate you in the audience for attending the session today, and we're very glad to see you so interested in ethical research and publishing. Thank you also to our speakers, Ashi and Stanley, and thank you all again, and have a great day.